Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to Pat's educational series. We're talking about racism and the history of racism today. I believe we're talking about gerrymandering, the history of the KKK, and voter suppression. What else are you doing? And then we're also doing the lynching of Alan Brooks. I think that education is really important to understand how we got here today. And you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. So history is really important. Thank you for everyone over there who also has to listen whether they want to or not. Xochitl, come on over.
Oh, fuck that. All right. So today I'm going to do a history thing about the lynching of Alan Brooks in 1910. But to gotta wait for the planes to fly by. Oh, it really doesn't? Oh, okay. All right. So, in 1910, Alan Brooks was hung from the Elks Lodge arch that was located on the corner of, well, in the street area of Main and Ackerd. But before we go into like the whole him getting lynched, the history of the arch itself has weird racist connotations behind it. While the Elks Lodge itself is not a racist organization and is a organization to better the community, in 1908, they decided to erect the arch in honor of the Elks Lodge like grand meeting shenanigans, which also occurred in the state. And they at the time, Dallas was only had a population of 90,000. They were getting ready for crowds of 50,000, totally disregarding the fact that like their own citizens earlier that year had struggled with multiple floods, like some of the worst floods of the early century, which left over 10,000 people homeless. And of course, the people that were left homeless were like the lower income and the black community. There was very little financial input from the city to help reconstruct any of the neighborhoods or to help the people out of damages or anything. However, the arch itself was people donated over $100,000 to erect this archway for just a few day convention for the Elks Lodge. And back then that was I think it equated to over $500,000 in their time. So first of all, the arch was not necessary. The previous cities who had the Elks Lodge convention had done nice little wicker arches and nice little community archways, but Dallas decided to go a step beyond and do $100,000 instead of investing in their community. Then when the Elks Lodge convention happened, which the arch was erected a week before the lodge, and then there was another flood, and once again people were displaced, but people were more concerned about this convention happening, and they opened up all of the houses and opened their doors. All these restaurants opened their arms for all these out-of-towners. There was food and over 15,000 cattle slaughtered for food to be provided for these out-of-towners, while nothing was going on for the people who had been homeless in our own community. And those 15,000 cattle were then cooked by a previous Confederate soldier, actually. So the Cabell family was the one who were in charge of the barbecue. They were the ones who were doing this giant feast for all these out-of-towners, all these Lodge people. And they were a huge Confederate family. They've actually been, the Cabell family has had 3 mayors in Dallas, and the eldest was actually a Confederate general. So it's kind of nice to know that like a bunch of Dallas fucking mayors were Confederate soldiers. They decided to come here to retire and do their shenanigans in Dallas. In the barbecue, he ended up having over 75 unnamed black people to cook the food for everybody, and he got all the credit. Like, he was the one who was like the one who cooked for everybody, while the 75 people who like literally dug a giant pit, cooked all this meat, slaughtered all these animals, got no credit whatsoever. So like, fuck that. But so then skip ahead 2 years. The arch is still there because it's this giant metal thing, steel shenanigans. And so in 1910 on, what's it called? Balls. I don't think I actually wrote that date down. What's it called? In 1910, Alan Brooks was accused of raping a 2 or 3 year old daughter of the balls. Why didn't I? Oh, of Bevins. The daughter of the Bevins. I don't know how to say their name. Sorry. She disappeared on February 23rd, 1910. She was missing for a few hours, then was found in the house, her family's house with Alan Brooks. Alan Brooks was their handyman and their like furnace man. I guess he kept the fire going. But he had worked for the family for like years and years and was like known around like with them. But upon he was instantly like taken into custody, and then upon inspection, the daughter had evidence of being attempted rape, and then they like inspected him, and they also found evidence of attempted rape, but still like it was very questionable, and the doctor wasn't highly trusted. He was also known for being a known racist as well. And almost immediately, the cops started having protection for him. But on that first night that he was in custody, there was already a group of 200 men wanting to like take him out of the jail and lynch him themselves. So for the next few days, he was transferred from county jail to county jail, but the mob continued to follow him until March 3rd, 1910. He went into the courthouse of Dallas Courthouse. It used to be called the Old Red Courthouse. It's just down the street. Like, it's still here in Dallas. And so when he arrived, he got to see his lawyer for only 30 minutes. And this lawyer was his second appointed lawyer because his first lawyer decided to back out because he didn't see this case being reasonable. And so then the second lawyer was only permitted 30 minutes to speak to him, and then continue to try to like be like, hey, we need a defense. We need to have more of a case here. But they refused that. And what's it called? The mob outside grew from 200 to 1,000 people during that period, like during the first part of the court, whatever the court case. Yeah. And so then as the crowd kind of grew and grew, and there became multiple rumors of either them transferring Alan Brooks out of the court to another court, extending the case, and apparently that they weren't happy with that. So they decided to barge into the courthouse, go past 150 cops who later on claimed to not recognize anybody, claimed to not be able to stand against these men in the courthouse, and many of them had been known like former Confederate soldiers or Confederate people. They were also known like KKK members, and so the police weren't exactly guarding him. And so in the courthouse itself, the mob decided to put a rope around his neck and shove him out a second-story window, where he landed on his head. Unfortunately, this did not kill him. He was then dragged over a half mile to the arch, because once he landed, the cry ran out through the mob being like, take him to the arch, take him to the arch. And they continued to drag him by an automobile and which then like tore off all his like most of his clothes. His pants were ripped to shreds, and his like body was already bruised and like bloody by this point. And then once they got to the arch, the mob had already grown to a size of like around 5,000, some estimate, and a young man went over the arch and strung him up, where he hung for over 8 minutes. And while he was hanging, the crowd decided to like tear what remaining clothes he had for souvenirs. They took pictures as souvenirs to mark this momentous event that they had killed this black man, that they had provided swift justice. Actually, the Dallas Morning News had said, and I quote, "The noblest of all orders, the Elks build wiser than they knew when they erected the arch. For today it was an instrument of swift justice, because this mob went out to incite violence. This mob went outside to do harm. They were actually trying to set his body on fire when people kind of finally stood up and were like, let's just take his body down. The mob then proceeded to try to go back to the courthouse and get Beryl Oates and Bubba Robinson and hang them as well, because they were also two black men who were, about to face sentencing at the courthouse. However, they had already been moved for their own protection. Oh, cute doggy. Oh, sorry. So they had already been removed, but the crowd had already went over to that courthouse and stormed in there. Actually, later on that night, the city got multiple petitions to allow some people to go into the courthouses to search for them. And eventually the city allowed 20 men to go and search the county courthouse and the county jail. And luckily they came up empty-handed. But when it came down to trying to and do an investigation into this mob act, once again, the police and all the judges and all of those there could not recognize a single person in a crowd of 5,000 locals. Because this didn't happen this is going to happen in a month or so and everyone travel. No, this was an overnight, over a few days thing. And so it was all locals, and the police could not identify a single one. The Daily Express actually went on to quote, but preferred to endorse the breakout. The cops really didn't do anything, and the city did decided to basically end the investigation and just write it up to just an organized lynching. What's it called? Blah blah blah. But eventually the arch was removed later that year. It was going to be removed earlier, but then once the lynching happened, at first it was a sign of hey, we killed this guy, but then eventually people kind of started feeling slight shame. I don't know, they didn't want to be remembered for this is where we killed a black dude after a couple months. But they still sold his clothing, they still sold the postcards, and from different angles too, with a lot of kids in them. But yeah. Alan Brooks, it doesn't matter if he molested that kid or not. He deserved a fair trial. I mean, he did not deserve to be lynched by a bunch of fucking assholes who thought that his body deserved to be dragged or burned or strung up. That's not the justice system that this country was built on. This was in 1910. This was just over 100 years ago. Just down the street, just downtown. You can where City Market and the Jewel and fucking the Jacksons, that's all within a block of where this man died. We walk on Ackerton, Maine all the time, and we're walking where this man lost his life, where he was dragged alive for over half a mile for some hearsay, for a daughter who did not even die. what's it called, for a man who was known in his community for being peaceful, for being like a pretty upright dude. Like, but yeah, but he unfortunately died in 1910, and that's a really shitty thing that happened in Dallas.
Thank you, Xochitl. Austin is going to come up now and talk about voter suppression.
Hello, everyone. Just that. All right. Hello, my name is Austin Anderson. I'll be talking about the history of voter suppression. It's one thing that has plagued our nation for a long time. It's affected many minority communities, particularly the African American community, the Latino community, the Native American community, and the Asian community. But before we get into that, I wanted to take this chance to honor the life of Mr. Georgia Congressman John Lewis, who fought for these voting rights. I want to tell you a little bit of history about him. John Lewis died at the age of 80 on Friday. He was one of the original 6 civil rights leaders. As a student growing up, he listened to a lot of the radio broadcasts of Martin Luther King and got inspired to march in the 60s. One of the biggest things he did was organize sit-ins at lunch counters in states like Georgia and Alabama. Risked his life for different freedom minds throughout the segregated South, including states like Texas, Florida, Georgia, places like Atlanta. And he was one of the major speakers in the 1963 March on Washington on August 28, 1963. And one of the biggest things that he did for voting rights was he participated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On that particular day called Bloody Sunday, he and 600 other protesters marched across that bridge and were met with police resistance, canines, dogs, chased down, turned into a riot. He was bloodied, fractured his skull, sent to the hospital. But as he said, I was left here on this earth by God to help out the various communities that I represent and that I want to be a part of. So I wanted to take that time to honor this man who fought his entire life for voting rights and to fight against the very harsh tactics of voter suppression. And he was only 80 years old, and I wanted to honor him before I got more into this. So the thing is with voter suppression, there's many various ways that it is done. And before I get into the history, I wanted to observe the various voter suppression that happened in this state, specifically on March 3rd, 2020 during Super Tuesday. So obviously the state of Texas has a very long, harsh history about it. The recent voter suppression on March 3rd, 2020 for Super Tuesday in various counties like Travis County, where voters, especially near the University of Texas and the Black and Latino areas of that county, had people standing in line for over 6 hours. In Houston, at the Texas Southern University, people were camped out hours to get to the polls. There were some people that stood in line, but before they stopped letting people by 7 p.m. and they weren't allowed. They didn't get to the front of the line to put their polls in until almost 1:30 to 2 a.m. in the city of Houston. That is absolutely unacceptable, and we have to keep fighting it. And one of the other things is like faulty voting machines, faulty fighting against like voting by mail, absentee voting, faulty things like that. And that's one of the various things. Now, you know, Texas always tries to say, at least their government always tries to say, we've improved the voting system, we've improved the voting system. But every election, there's always problems, always problems. But in order to tackle this, we need to go into the history. So, going from there, we must go all the way back to after 1865, after the American Civil War. So, after the American Civil War, African American slaves were freed after the destruction of the Confederacy, which Texas was a part of. Congress eventually passed the 15th Amendment that stated that voting rights could not be, quote, denied or abridged by the United States or any state by account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In the South, for the first time, democracy was for the men of all races, black and white. However, after this, we see the first instance of voter suppression. No matter if it was black voters or black officials, they faced constant terrorism by the KKK and other white supremacist groups. From the Reconstruction era of the civil rights, from the Reconstruction era to the civil rights era, we had various forms of voter suppression. One of them I mentioned earlier was obviously intimidation. Another one was literacy test that literally no one could pass. Now let's get into that literacy test. It would have things like recite the entire Constitution, draw random words, backwards, forward, some of the hardest words in the dictionary, in under 10 minutes. So imagine you go into a poll, try and register to vote, and you have to recite the entire Constitution or random, very hard to remember provisions in state laws. I guarantee that almost no one here could recite the entire Constitution or remember every single line in state laws. That was one of the various harsh things about these literacy tests. And why states like in Mississippi, up till 1960, less than 10% of African Americans were able to vote. So, and unfortunately during that time, even without the literacy tests, even if they weren't even implemented, African Americans at the time in the South suffered a high rate of illiteracy due to centuries of oppression and poverty. So these tests had a very high fail rate. Another pre-civil rights voting suppression was the poll tax. The poll tax was a fixed sum that you as a citizen had to pay in order to vote. That fee would vary per state. It was a huge disadvantage to working class voters, poor people, African Americans, and Native Americans. The last form of voter suppression was the grandfather clause. So going back to the poll tax, so a lot of these laws that intentionally meant to disenfranchise African Americans, natives, and other people from voting, at the same time, those elected officials who were trying to voter suppress were actually screwing over also poor whites. So with the grandfather clause that they initiated in many states, they said that if you didn't have any type of servitude, if you've been a citizen of this country before the Civil War or something like that, then you were entitled to voting rights, and the things like the literacy test and the poll tax didn't apply to you. So it was with those obvious rules that this voter suppression was specifically targeted to race, because they screwed over a lot of minority people, but they didn't want to leave out the poor whites, who a lot of them were also had struggles with literacy and education, but they didn't want to make all of them mad. So that's why they did things like that. And the process, up to that point, until the civil rights movement was formed by these different voter rights suppressions along with segregation and things like that. And there's a different movement after World War II. They said that if people can serve this country and try to fight for freedoms like fighting against Nazi Germany, fighting against imperialist Japan and fascist Italy. Why is it that they come back to this country and not everyone has the same freedoms or isn't free or couldn't vote? It didn't make any sense. So after World War II, post World War II era, the late 1940s is when the civil rights movement started. And the process really started to pick up in the 1950s to establish strong revamped voting rights with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It provided initiate important provisions to protect voting rights. However, it did not complete the mission because it did not get rid of literacy tests and other pre-qualifications such as like congressional quizzes. So the fight would continue well into the 1960s. Leaders such as John Lewis and Martin Luther King led the charge throughout the 1960s. But it wasn't until after the events of Bloody Sunday, where marchers crossed the Evan Pettus Bridge and were beaten by police and mauled by dogs. It was going on concurrently as part of the Selma to Montgomery March. It was a nonviolent protest to demonstrate the desire of African Americans to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of segregationist repression. It was part of the region-wide movement for voting racial injustice, which was part of the civil rights movement. After this massive event that was nationalized, and plenty of people can look up the footage, literally people were walking from the bridge, police walked towards them, dogs charged at them, they were beaten, lots of blood, one person died, and it was a whole week-long event. 2 days later, President Lyndon Johnson of Texas put a joint session of Congress and said, we need to make this new voting rights law and we need to pass it as soon as possible. Because the events at Selma, Alabama was one of the worst things in American history. One person died, a lot who were bloodied, and leaders like Martin Luther King have been asking this for years. And they wanted the carnage to stop because as Americans, we all have entitlements to vote. That's actually our duty as citizens, is to vote, no matter what. So if you can't guarantee the right to vote, then we're not all free here. So after that, like I said, 2 months after that event, it was passed, because Selma actually happened in March. 2 months later, the U.S. Congress passed it by large margins, and then President Lyndon Johnson of Texas signed into law on August 9th, 1965. And that leads up to the voting suppression up until the Civil Rights Movement. But now that we've talked about the history, now we have to speak about modern day voting suppression. Because even with the strength of the Voting Rights Act, which helped millions of African Americans be eligible to vote, they don't have to do literacy tests, they don't have to do poll taxes, they don't have to do constitutional quizzes. They have equal rights as everybody else. But many of those racist people that still didn't want to do whatever it takes to make sure those African Americans couldn't be able to vote because they were so afraid of change and they didn't want things to happen. So one of the things that of modern voter rights suppression is, obviously, as I mentioned, intimidation. That still happened. Like in this recent election, like in 2008, you had places in the South and even in the North where people will literally, in states like Texas, Georgia, where open carry law is actually a thing, and you can obviously open carry as long as you're not in like a federal building or something like that. So people would literally stand outside a line with like an AK-47 or a pistol and all that, just kind of scare people from voting. And that was one of the main tactics. Obviously they couldn't do things like the KKK where they literally just kidnapped, snatched people and just killed you, because obviously you would just get held accountable for that. But they would literally hold people and try to intimidate them and scare them off from even voting. And that happened as recently as 2008, the historic election of President Barack Obama, who was the first black president. a lot of people out there, racist people, they would want to do whatever it takes to make sure that didn't happen. So obviously that's modern day intimidation. Let's see. In fact, I think disinformation is another popular tactic for suppressing votes, such as in the state of Arizona during, I think, 2012, telling people that they could vote a day after election to avoid long lines. Telling people that if you register to vote for a particular organization, let's say like this organization that supports, I guess, the Democratic Party or something like that, or a civil rights group, that you wouldn't be allowed to vote. And organizations making robocalls telling them, wrong polling places or some things like that. So obviously misinformation, you even have that today with the rampant internet, social media. There's all kinds of, as you could say, fake news. But obviously, if you want the best information, look at your county's website and figure out where you got to vote. Last thing is strict voter ID laws, such as many states would ask for very much like multiple forms of ID, such as like a driver's license or a birth certificate or a other state ID like a passport. And in many states, in some regions, people don't have multiple forms of ID. I mean, they may have a birth certificate or whatever, but let's say they lose their license, then what are they going to do? Because if you look at some of these areas, they'll purposely shut down a Department of Motor Vehicles in a certain county, and then you have to drive 150 miles just to get another form of state ID. And they won't take things like student IDs, or if you're in public housing, they give you IDs for that, and they won't take that. So, what are people supposed to do? I mean, they can't figure it out, and then people don't have transportation, then they can't, get that ID, and then they won't be able to vote because they don't have multiple forms of ID. But even with all of that, the Voting Rights Act stopped majority of that, and in elections such as 2008 and 2012, registration was at an all-time high, and issues with voting suppression was mostly quelled. But unfortunately, part of the Voting Rights Act faced throughout history Supreme Court decisions whether if certain parts of that Voting Rights Act was upheld as constitutional. And unfortunately in 2013, as I'll get into, part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. So in 2013, in a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, struck down a major section of the Voting Rights Act called Section 4B of that act, was to ensure that states that had a long history of discriminatory voting laws did not pass new restrictions impacting people of color. Any voting rules would have to be approved by the federal government. So states like Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, certain areas of New York, Kentucky, Alaska, if they were to pass any type of new voting laws, they had to go through what was called a pre-clearance to make sure that those laws would not be too strict or stop people from being able to register to vote or have strict voter ID laws. And it was very, very effective, because with the Voting Rights Act, if they were to try it, they would be taken to court and said, this is within violation of the Voting Rights Act. So this law that you have passed is just going to get struck down. So don't even try it. It was very effective up to that point. But obviously, people wanted to keep challenging, and it actually was successful. And because, going back to that, Section 5 of that act, of the Voting Rights Act, going back to the states, was saying that those states that had the history had to deal with the plea clearance. And after that Supreme Court ruling, when Section 4B and Section 5 was basically unenforceable, they couldn't enforce and stop states from enforcing harsher voting rules. that the Voting Rights Act was pretty much ineffective. But the Supreme Court luckily did give clearance to Congress to come up with a new solution, because the Voting Rights Act was based in 1965 on that history, but in 2013, a lot of courts argue, well, it's 2013, 1965 was, I don't know how to do the math, like 50 years ago or something like that. So this is old, outdated data. So this needs to be thrown out and this needs to be started over. So, and one of the biggest things after that was strict voter ID laws. And in Republican-controlled legislatures passed laws barring things like, obviously, people like convicted felons who have done their time, have jobs, pay taxes. Basically, they don't have votes rights at all. Under the Voting Rights Act, a lot of those states that had that said if you've gone to prison, if you commit a felony, go to prison, done your time, then you'll get your voting rights restored, to basically prevent what's called taxation without representation, which is a big thing, because imagine it, you don't have able to vote, but yet you're getting taxed by the government. Don't you want hearsay what the government does with the money that they take from your hard-earned income? And that was one of the biggest things. Unfortunately, a lot of states since then have closed a lot of voting polls, and one of the most harsher things that one state tried to pass, I'm not sure which one it was, but tightening, one of the things is proving your state of citizenship, such as like Texas or Arizona, where they have a lot of immigrants. People say like, show your papers or prove your citizenship or things like that. Or somebody that has that's become a new citizen, that can be very complicated. And then last thing that a lot of states have done since, unfortunately, the Voting Rights Act was gutted with 2013 was that they tightened the window for absentee, overseas, early voting, and banned same-day voter registration. So basically a hindrance to voting by mail, same-day registration, like voting same day as you wanted to vote, and things like that. But one of the things in 2019 by Congressman John Lewis was to enact a new Voting Rights Act that would solve this problem and restore everything. So in December 2019, to counter all these new methods of voter suppression that was previously stopped for the most part by the Voting Rights Act, was to completely restore and have pre-clearance and accountability provisions. And it would use data, instead of going back to 1965, it would use data from the last 25 years to say if your state, and Texas is very guilty of this, and the state of Georgia, as we've seen in the governor's race in 2018 and the recent primary election there, where voter polling stations closed down, and mostly African American areas. However, in North Atlanta, mostly white areas had no issues at all. So, in those two states, based on the history, would say we will hold these Secretary of State officials who hold these elections accountable and make sure that there are less instances of voting machines going down, of voter registration in Texas being put on hold because somebody may have misspelled their name or changed address, which even in this state, I've changed it, not in this state, but even in the state of Alabama where I used to live, even I changed my address. And I couldn't imagine, going into the election, and because let's say I moved across the street or I moved 2 blocks down the road saying, oh, sir, you didn't change your address, so we're just not going to allow you to vote. It's like I live in the same county. I live in the same district. So why is it that you're not letting me, vote and something like that? So that new Voting Rights Act would stop things like that. And I wanted to say that it did pass the House. And it was one of the last great things that John Lewis did before his passing. Unfortunately, it is one of the 200 bills under the Republican-led Senate by Mitch McConnell, that it still has not been brought up to be able to vote. Because unfortunately, a lot of these new voter suppression, voting polling closings have happened in Republican state legislative states like Texas, Georgia, and Alabama. And they're afraid that if this new Voting Rights Act were to be enacted, voting turnout would be very high and Republicans wouldn't win many much elections. But even if you take the partisan thing out, as the United States, you should always guarantee people's rights to vote, regardless of election outcome. And we need to stop playing these partisan games. But until then, because the Republican-led Senate will not bring this to the floor, and that's why I wanted to say that this election is very important, because we must, as voters, we must let this Voting Rights Act be passed. We need to take the Senate back from these Republicans who will not let this bill be passed, to observe the legacy of John Lewis, who fought and some of his colleagues lost their lives to protect voting rights. So this election is very important to take the Senate from them and get this law passed immediately, to fight the enemy that is voter suppression and guarantee the right to vote for all citizens of the United States of America. This was a very important topic to observe during the civil rights era and all the things going on today. And I appreciate your time, and I wanted to say this: Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Someone help me. I don't have hand grip yet. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about voter suppression? Does anyone have any questions about voter registration? Does anyone have any questions about voting polls and where to find them? And where to find information on who you're voting for? These are important questions. They can be stupid questions. They can be anybody. What's your question? You have to answer it, though.
So I wanted to say, going back to obviously, voting and, taking back the Senate from this Republican-led Senate that doesn't want to enforce these protective rights. So going back to obviously registering to vote and all that. So you have to go to your specific county website or the Texas Secretary of State website or whatever state that you're in. Register by your address, where you live, and it's pretty simple as that. And it'll tell you, and after you register in this state, you'll get a voter ID, and all you have to do is bring some type of Texas state ID, such as a driver's license, a concealed weapons license, the voter ID thing that you get in the mail anyway, and show it at the polls and just go ahead and vote. It's pretty simple. It took like 3 minutes. I actually showed up at a protest for a women's march and just literally signed a form. It took me like 2 minutes. So no excuse to not register to vote. It's pretty easy and there's plenty of resources. But like I said, if you have any questions, just ask anybody that's part of the People Against the System, and we'll get to you. And I also wanted to announce that for this November election coming up, that there is actually early voting in this state, which is a great deal. So I plan on voting the first day, and I'm going to be doing a rideshare program. So if anybody needs a ride to the polls and doesn't have a vehicle, then we will get there. We will get to the polls whatever way possible. And that is that. And I appreciate your time.
And if you are registered, God, Lord. And if you are registered, please, 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 please vote. It is your civil duty. If you are registered, it should take 2 minutes. It should not take 6 hours like Austin noted. It should not. Should. Don't think that your vote doesn't matter. That is the lagging consequences of voter suppression. You matter. Your vote matters. Your voice matters. Does anyone have any questions about the lynching that happened on Main and Ackerd? Yes. Does anyone have any other questions? General questions? Anything? Anything? What?
One last thing. Texas is a swing state, so your vote does matter, and we can change this country. We're going to make this state blue. Let's go.
Yes. Texas is purple. Texas is purple. Texas is purple. Okay. Thank you for everybody who came. We'll be back Thursday with more education. Tomorrow we march, and then we'll also be marching Friday. Same place. We meet at the same spot, same time. Our Instagram is People Against the System, and then our Facebook is also People Against the System, and then our Twitter is also People Against the System. We've got them all. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on our social medias, or you can just grab one of us right here, right now. Austin is handing out some informational flyers right now. See you at the polls. Thank you for watching. Good night, y'all.